From the year 1998 to 2000, America executed 159 people, one of the deadliest years in modern death row history. In this video, we'll examine top 20 cases, the crimes, the final meals, and the last words that echoed through the chambers. This is Sin, Crime and Silence Records. Karla Faye Tucker, State of Texas. On June 13, 1983, 23-year-old Karla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend, Danny Garrett, broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean. Armed with a pickaxe and hammer, they intended to steal Dean's motorcycle parts. Inside, they encountered Dean and his companion, Deborah Thornton. Dean was attacked while sleeping. Tucker struck him multiple times with a pickaxe. When Thornton tried to escape, she was also attacked. Tucker later admitted to delivering the final blows to both victims with the pickaxe, stating she experienced a sense of release during the act. Police were led to the scene through a tip. Tucker confessed in detail and showed no remorse during her initial statements. A pickaxe covered in blood and forensic evidence confirmed her involvement. She was convicted of capital murder in 1984. The prosecution presented her confession and crime scene evidence. Tucker's defense did not dispute her guilt. She was sentenced to death by a Harris County jury. During her time on death row, Tucker underwent a religious conversion, claiming to have become a born-again Christian. Over the years, her transformation gained attention, with spiritual advisors, Christian leaders, and even international figures advocating for clemency. Supporters pointed to her remorse, changed behavior, and rehabilitation. Mental health was not a central issue in appeals. On February 2, 1998, she spent time praying and reading the Bible. She was visited by her husband, Minister Dana Lane Brown, and close friends. For her last meal, she requested a banana, peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Karla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection on February 3, 1998, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. Her final words were, "I want to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this. Baby, I love you. Ron, give Peggy a hug for me. Everybody has been so good to me. I love all of you very much. I'm going to be face to face with Jesus now. Warden, I'm ready." Gary Graham, Shaka Sankofa, State of Texas. On May 13, 1981, 53-year-old Bobby Lambert was shot in the parking lot of a Houston Safeway store during what was described as a robbery. Lambert was found with a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. The attacker fled the scene before police arrived. A 26-year-old woman, Bernadine Skillern, claimed she witnessed the shooting from her car. Based solely on her identification, Gary Graham, then 17 years old, was arrested 5 days later. No physical evidence, such as fingerprints, murder weapon, or forensic matches, was ever presented linking Graham to the crime. Graham was charged with capital murder. During the trial, the prosecution relied on Skillern's testimony as the sole eyewitness. Multiple other witnesses who claimed Graham did not match the shooter's appearance were not called. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict. Graham was sentenced to death in 1981. Controversy surrounded the trial for its limited evidence, racial bias allegations, and ineffective legal defense. Appeals spanned nearly 2 decades, drawing national and international attention. While incarcerated, Graham changed his name to Shaka Sankofa and maintained his innocence. He became a vocal critic of the justice system, writing essays and giving interviews from death row. His case attracted support from civil rights groups, religious leaders, and international figures. Amnesty International and the European Union petitioned for clemency. On June 21, 2000, Sankofa refused a special last meal and was served the prison's standard menu. He spent his final hours with attorneys, spiritual advisors, and supporters. Vigils were held outside the prison, with protesters and media present. Gary Graham, legally known as Shaka Sankofa, was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on June 22, 2000. He was pronounced dead at 8:49 p.m. His final words were, "I die fighting for what I believed in. I die fighting for what I lived for. I'm being murdered for a crime I didn't commit. But I'm ready to die. I'm ready to hold my head up high. I'm not the killer. Odell Barnes, Jr., State of Texas. On November 30, 1989, 44-year-old Helen Bass was found dead inside her home in Wichita Falls, Texas. Her body showed signs of blunt force trauma, stab wounds, and a gunshot to the head. Evidence at the scene suggested a struggle. The home had been ransacked, and Bass had also been sexually assaulted. That same night, a neighbor reported seeing Odell Barnes, Jr. in Bass's yard. He was observed jumping over a fence and falling to the street. Investigators recovered a broken rifle, a blood-stained knife, and a lamp covered in blood inside the home. Bass's personal handgun was missing. Barnes was arrested in January 1990. His fingerprint was found on the lamp. The missing handgun was later recovered from an acquaintance. During trial, prosecutors presented this as conclusive evidence of his guilt. However, years later, forensic reviews raised doubts about the integrity and timing of the evidence collection. Allegations of contamination, lack of DNA testing, and flawed investigative procedures cast a shadow over the conviction. Despite growing concerns from human rights groups, European diplomats, and even the French Prime Minister, all appeals were denied. Requests for DNA testing of the evidence were rejected in the final days. Supporters argued Barnes had not received a fair trial. Prosecutors maintained his guilt. While on death row, Barnes maintained his innocence. He gained international attention as a possible wrongful conviction case and corresponded with activists, journalists, and faith leaders. He expressed hope that his case would lead to changes in how evidence is handled in capital trials. On February 29, 2000, Barnes was offered a last meal. He declined to request food, instead stating that he wanted justice, equality, and world peace. He was served the prison's standard meal. Odell Barnes, Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on March 1, 2000. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. His final words were, "I want to send much love to my family, my supporters, and my attorneys. Thank you for proving my innocence, even though the courts did not recognize it. May your fight continue, and may what is happening today serve as a lesson for the future." Joseph Stanley Falder, State of Texas. On April 8, 1975, 75-year-old Inez Phillips was found murdered in her home in Gladewater, Texas. She had been beaten and suffocated. The motive was robbery. Jewelry and cash were missing from the scene. Phillips was a wealthy widow known in the local community. Canadian national Joseph Stanley Falder was arrested in Colorado later that year. He confessed to participating in the crime as part of a planned burglary, though the confession's circumstances were later scrutinized. Authorities stated he was lured to Texas by accomplices who believed Phillips kept large sums of cash in her home. During the trial, prosecutors presented Falder's confession, testimony from co-conspirators, and physical evidence linking him to the crime. Falder was convicted of capital murder in 1977 and sentenced to death. A key issue in the case emerged when it was revealed that Falder had not been informed of his right to contact the Canadian consulate, an obligation under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. This failure drew international criticism. For over 2 decades, Falder remained on death row. His case gained attention from the Canadian government, the United Nations, and Amnesty International. Canadian officials and UN representatives formally protested the violation of international law. Despite these efforts, Texas authorities maintained the conviction and sentence. While incarcerated, Falder reportedly became more introspective but did not speak extensively to the media. Appeals focused largely on the consular rights violation and procedural errors during trial, not on mental health or personal transformation. On December 29, 1999, Falder was offered a last meal. He requested a hamburger, French fries, and a chocolate milkshake. He was visited by consular officials and spiritual advisors. Joseph Stanley Falder was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on December 30, 1999. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. His final words were brief. "I am deeply sorry for what happened. That's all I have to say." David Wayne Spence, State of Texas. On July 13, 1982, the bodies of 3 teenagers, Jill Montgomery, Raylene Rice, and Kenneth Franks, were discovered near Lake Waco in Texas. All 3 had been abducted, bound, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The crime scene was brutal. Jill Montgomery had been stabbed multiple times, and Kenneth Franks had his throat slashed. The victims were last seen the evening before at a marina. Police suspected they had been lured into a trap. The case remained unsolved for over a year until investigators focused on 30-year-old David Wayne Spence, a local man with a criminal record, and two other suspects, Anthony and Gilbert Melendez. Spence was arrested in 1983. He denied involvement in the murders. The prosecution relied on a mix of circumstantial evidence, jailhouse informant testimony, and bite mark analysis. A forensic odontologist claimed Spence's teeth matched marks found on the victims, a technique later criticized for its unreliability. No physical evidence, such as fingerprints, DNA, or murder weapons, linked Spence to the scene. Spence was convicted in 1984 and sentenced to death. His trial drew controversy over the heavy reliance on discredited forensic methods and paid informant testimonies. Years later, several key witnesses recanted or admitted they had lied under pressure or in exchange for deals. Despite these developments, courts denied Spence's appeals. While on death row, Spence continued to proclaim his innocence. Journalists, legal experts, and innocence advocacy groups began reviewing his case. They raised serious doubts about the validity of the conviction, pointing to a lack of direct evidence and compromised testimony. On April 2, 1997, Spence was offered a last meal. He requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a chocolate milkshake. He met with his spiritual advisor and exchanged letters with supporters who believed in his innocence. David Wayne Spence was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on April 3, 1997. He was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. His final words were, "I am innocent. I didn't kill those kids. I never did. I'm at peace. That's all." Napoleon Beasley, State of Texas. On April 19, 1994, in Tyler, Texas, 17-year-old Napoleon Beasley shot and killed 63-year-old John Luttig during a carjacking attempt in the victim's driveway. Luttig, a prominent businessman and the father of U.S. Federal Judge J. Michael Luttig, was returning home with his wife when Beasley ambushed them. Beasley fired 2 shots into Luttig's head and attempted to shoot his wife, but the gun misfired. He fled the scene in Luttig's car, which was later abandoned. Beasley was arrested shortly afterward. He confessed to the crime and cooperated with authorities. The murder weapon was recovered, and forensic evidence confirmed his involvement. At trial, prosecutors highlighted the brutality of the act and the prominence of the victim's family. In 1995, Beasley was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His age at the time of the crime, 17, became central to a growing legal and moral debate. Multiple appeals were filed, focusing on his youth, racial bias in jury selection, and the fairness of the proceedings. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately upheld the conviction. Texas Governor George W. Bush, then in office, denied clemency. The case continued to draw international condemnation even after Bush left office. During his time on death row, Beasley was described as respectful and remorseful. He wrote essays, including one titled Death Row and Me, which reflected on his crime, growth, and regret. Supporters pointed to his transformation and intellect as arguments against his execution. On the day of his execution, Beasley declined a special last meal and was served the standard prison fare. He spent his final hours with family, his spiritual advisor, and legal counsel. Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on May 28, 2002. He was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. His final words were, "The act I committed was not just a horrible crime. It was a senseless act of violence. I am sorry not only for what I did but also for the pain I caused. No one wins tonight. No one gets closure. No one walks away victorious." Ponchai Kamau Wilkerson, State of Texas. On November 28, 1990, 22-year-old Ponchai Kamau Wilkerson and his accomplice, Wilton Bethany Jr., entered the Royal Gold Jewelry store in Houston, Texas. During the armed robbery, Wilkerson shot and killed the store owner, Chung Myong-e, with a single gunshot to the head at close range. He then fled with stolen jewelry and cash. Wilkerson was arrested days later and charged with capital murder. He did not claim self-defense or accident. The prosecution presented eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage, and ballistic evidence linking him to the scene. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death in July 1991. Throughout his appeals, Wilkerson challenged the fairness of his trial but did not deny committing the robbery. His case gained notoriety for his courtroom behavior and later for his actions while incarcerated. In 1998, he and 6 other inmates attempted to escape from the Ellis unit but failed. Wilkerson's sentence remained unchanged, and all appeals were eventually exhausted. On death row, Wilkerson became known for his outspoken defiance of the justice system. He filed lawsuits, protested through hunger strikes, and remained uncooperative with prison officials. Supporters cited him as an example of racial injustice in sentencing, and his execution was delayed multiple times due to public protest and legal filings. On March 14, 2000, Wilkerson refused to leave his cell and had to be subdued with chemical agents. As the execution began, he spit out a metallic object, identified as a universal handcuff and leg restraint key. The source of the key remains unknown. It had been hidden in his mouth, possibly as a final act of resistance. No official investigation ever confirmed how he acquired it. Wilkerson declined a special last meal and was given the standard prison meal. He did not meet with family or spiritual advisors. Ponchai Kamau Wilkerson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on March 14, 2000. He was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. His final statement was brief and cryptic. "This is not a capital case." Robert Earl Carter, State of Texas. On September 17, 1992, 6 members of the Davis family were found murdered in their home in Somerville, Texas. The victims included 4 children, their mother Bobby Davis, and her 16-year-old daughter. Each had been shot or stabbed multiple times, and the house was set on fire in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Robert Earl Carter, a corrections officer and close family friend, was arrested shortly afterward. He had visible burn injuries. Initially, Carter implicated his wife, Teresa, and family friend Anthony Graves in the crime. Police and prosecutors built their case around Carter's statements and circumstantial evidence. During the trial, Carter testified against Graves. He claimed the murders were carried out jointly. Graves was convicted and sentenced to death. Carter received the same sentence. However, in the days leading up to his own execution, Carter recanted, stating he had acted alone and falsely accused the others to protect his wife from prosecution. Despite the confession and mounting doubt about Graves' involvement, Carter's execution proceeded. Appeals for clemency and a stay were denied. On death row, Carter expressed increasing remorse. In a formal affidavit and multiple statements, he took full responsibility for the murders and insisted that Graves had no role in the crime. His recantation became central to the later exoneration of Anthony Graves. On May 30, 1998, Carter was offered a last meal. He requested smothered pork chops, fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, black-eyed peas, cornbread, a salad, cake, and punch. He spent time with his family and legal team. Robert Earl Carter was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on May 31, 1998. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. His final words were, "It was me and me alone. Anthony Graves had nothing to do with it. I lied on him in court. I was trying to save my wife. I am sorry for all the pain I've caused." Betty Lou Beets, State of Texas. On August 6, 1983, Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas firefighter, was reported missing by his wife, Betty Lou Beets, in Henderson County, Texas. She claimed he had gone fishing and never returned. Initial searches turned up no sign of him. The case remained unsolved for 2 years. In 1985, following a tip from her adult son, police searched the property again. They discovered the remains of Jimmy Don Beets buried in a wishing well behind the house. A second body, Doyle Wayne Barker, another of Beets' previous husbands who had also gone missing, was later discovered buried in a garage. Both men had been shot. Beets was arrested on June 8, 1985. During questioning, her son Robert Branson testified that he had helped his mother conceal Jimmy Don's body after she admitted to killing him. Beets was charged with capital murder in the death of Jimmy Don. She did not confess. At trial, prosecutors presented physical evidence from the property and testimony from Branson. The defense argued that Beets had suffered years of domestic abuse and claimed the killing was in self-defense. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to death on October 11, 1985. She was not tried for the murder of Doyle Wayne Barker due to her existing death sentence. Beets spent 15 years on death row. Her case drew widespread attention due to her age, gender, and personal history of abuse. Supporters cited her background as a battered woman, and the case became part of a larger public debate about domestic violence and the criminal justice system. All appeals and clemency requests were ultimately denied. On February 23, 2000, Beets declined to make a special request for a last meal and was served the standard prison meal. She spent her final hours in prayer and met with her spiritual advisor. Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on February 24, 2000. She was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. She declined to make a final statement. Robert Excel White, State of Texas. On October 28, 1978, Robert Excel White entered a convenience store in Conroe, Texas, intending to commit robbery. Inside, he encountered 72-year-old store clerk Harlan Holcomb. According to witness accounts and forensic reports, White shot Holcomb during the attempted robbery and fled the scene without taking any money. Holcomb died from a gunshot wound to the head. The crime shocked the local community due to the victim's age and the apparently senseless nature of the killing. White was arrested shortly after. He initially denied involvement but later confessed under interrogation. Ballistics matched the bullet to a weapon in White's possession. Witnesses placed him near the scene before and after the shooting. White was convicted of capital murder in 1979. His defense raised concerns about his mental competency, citing his long-standing visual impairment, he was nearly blind, and a documented history of mental illness, including schizophrenia. Despite these issues, the court found him competent to stand trial. He was sentenced to death. Over the years, multiple appeals were filed on the grounds of mental incompetence. Attorneys argued that White's condition deteriorated while on death row and that he could not understand the nature of his execution. Medical professionals offered conflicting testimony. Ultimately, all appeals were denied. White spent nearly 2 decades on death row. He reportedly struggled with mental clarity and isolation. Several advocacy groups petitioned for clemency, emphasizing his impaired vision and psychiatric condition, but these efforts were unsuccessful. On October 29, 1997, White requested a last meal consisting of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and cornbread. He met with spiritual counselors and made brief phone calls to family members. Robert Excel White was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on October 30, 1997. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. His final words were, "I've been treated unfairly, but I forgive. May the Lord take me now." James Russell Beathard, State of Texas. On November 25, 1984, in San Augustine County, Texas, Joe Wilkerson, his wife Zelma, and their 14-year-old grandson Billy were found shot to death in their home. The attack appeared targeted, and nothing of significant value was stolen. Investigators soon focused on Rodney Reed, who was engaged in a custody dispute with the Wilkerson family. Reed, in turn, implicated James Beathard, a friend and pharmacist, as a co-conspirator. Beathard was arrested on December 5, 1984, and charged with capital murder. He denied involvement from the beginning. At trial, the prosecution relied heavily on Reed's testimony. There was no physical evidence connecting Beathard to the crime scene, no fingerprints, DNA, or ballistic links. Beathard was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1985. Years later, Reed recanted, stating he had lied under pressure to save himself and that Beathard had no role in the killings. Despite the recantation and widespread concern from legal experts, the courts refused to grant Beathard a new trial. Appeals were repeatedly denied. Doubts about the case continued to grow, particularly concerning prosecutorial conduct and reliance on a single, now recanted testimony. Beathard spent 14 years on death row. He maintained his innocence throughout and corresponded with journalists and supporters. Several advocacy groups argued that the state had executed a man without verifying the integrity of the evidence against him. On December 8, 1999, Beathard declined a special last meal and was served the standard prison menu. He spent his final hours writing letters and praying with a chaplain. James Russell Beathard was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on December 9, 1999. He was pronounced dead at 6:23 p.m. His final words were, "I am innocent. I did not kill those people. I hope someday the truth will come out. I'm at peace." Travis Trevino Runnels, State of Texas. On January 29, 2003, at the Clements Unit Prison in Amarillo, Texas, Travis Runnels used a sharpened prison-issued razor to fatally slit the throat of 38-year-old Stanley Wiley, a civilian supervisor in the prison boot factory. Wiley died within minutes. Runnels had been serving a 70-year sentence for aggravated robbery at the time. Runnels attacked Wiley after being reassigned to work duties he had previously refused. Witnesses stated that Runnels struck without provocation and made no attempt to flee. He was restrained by other inmates and prison staff. He was charged with capital murder shortly after the incident. During the trial, the prosecution introduced a confession and statements from correctional officers. The defense did not contest that Runnels committed the act but focused on his psychological state and the volatile prison environment. Runnels was convicted of capital murder in 2005 and sentenced to death. Appeals focused on alleged misconduct by an expert witness, claims of racial bias in jury selection, and evolving standards for sentencing juvenile and young adult offenders. His age, 25 at the time of the offense, and the fact that the murder occurred in a high-stress prison environment became central issues for supporters calling for clemency. While on death row, Runnels participated in prison literacy programs and corresponded with prison reform advocates. Supporters described a shift in his demeanor and values over time. He expressed remorse in several letters but did not speak publicly about the crime until his final days. On December 10, 2019, Runnels declined to make a special last meal request and received the standard prison menu. He met with spiritual advisors and exchanged final messages with friends and supporters. Travis Trevino Runnels was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on December 11, 2019. He was pronounced dead at 7:26 p.m. His final words were, "I'm ready, Warden. I'm going home." Gerald Lee Mitchell, State of Texas. On June 4, 1985, in Houston, Texas, 17-year-old Gerald Lee Mitchell shot and killed 20-year-old Charles Marino during a botched drug transaction. Mitchell had set up a meeting to sell marijuana but instead attempted to rob Marino at gunpoint. During the confrontation, Mitchell shot Marino in the head. Marino died at the scene. Earlier that same day, Mitchell had also shot two other individuals, one fatally, in separate incidents involving a stolen car and disputes over drugs. The string of violent acts occurred within hours, involving different victims and locations. Mitchell was arrested shortly afterward. He confessed to the shootings during police interrogation. Investigators recovered the murder weapon and linked it to multiple scenes. Ballistic evidence and witness testimony supported the prosecution's timeline. At trial, Mitchell was tried as an adult despite being 17 at the time of the offenses. Texas law allowed capital prosecution of juveniles under certain conditions. Prosecutors emphasized the multiple shootings, while the defense argued for leniency due to Mitchell's age and unstable upbringing. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Texas did not offer a life without parole sentencing alternative at the time. Mitchell spent over 15 years on death row. His case drew attention from juvenile justice advocates who argued that executing individuals for crimes committed as minors reflected an inconsistent application of justice. Appeals challenging his death sentence based on age were denied. His case became part of the broader debate on juvenile executions that would later culminate in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, which banned the practice nationwide. While incarcerated, Mitchell expressed regret and engaged in spiritual counseling. He maintained a low profile and rarely spoke to the media. Letters from death row indicated remorse and reflection on his past actions. On October 21, 2001, Mitchell was offered a last meal. He requested a chef salad with ranch dressing, fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, corn on the cob, peach cobbler, and iced tea. He met with family members and prayed with a chaplain. Gerald Lee Mitchell was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on October 22, 2001. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. His final words were, "I am sorry for the pain, sorry for what I did. I accept responsibility, and I am going to a better place now. I love you all." Ricky Lee McGinn, State of Texas. On May 22, 1993, in Comanche County, Texas, 12-year-old Stephanie Flannery disappeared while in the care of her stepfather, Ricky Lee McGinn. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert near Proctor Lake. She had been sexually assaulted and struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object. McGinn became the prime suspect after inconsistencies in his account emerged. Bloodstains found on his clothing were linked to the victim, and pubic hairs recovered were said to be microscopically similar. He was arrested and charged with capital murder and aggravated sexual assault. At trial, prosecutors relied on forensic testimony and circumstantial evidence. No DNA testing was conducted on the physical evidence. McGinn was convicted in 1994 and sentenced to death. Years later, defense attorneys requested DNA testing on the hairs and semen samples. The request was initially denied. With his execution date nearing, then-Governor George W. Bush granted a rare 30-day reprieve on June 1, 2000, to allow limited DNA analysis. The tests failed to produce conclusive results, and the execution was rescheduled. McGinn remained defiant about his innocence in the sexual assault but admitted to having failed as a stepfather. His case drew national attention as debates over DNA testing and wrongful convictions intensified. McGinn requested a last meal of T-bone steak, French fries, dinner rolls, and sweet tea. He met privately with a chaplain and spent time with family members. Ricky Lee McGinn was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on June 22, 2000. He was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. I've said all I'm going to say. I'm ready to go. James Clayton, State of Texas. James Clayton was executed in Texas on May 25, 2000, for the 1987 murder of Lori Barrett, a 27-year-old teacher from Abilene. Barrett disappeared after her night shift. Her car was later found abandoned, and her body was discovered 12 days later in a remote area, shot twice, once in the head, once in the neck. Clayton, who lived nearby and had prior run-ins with the law, was arrested after witnesses claimed to have seen him driving Barrett's vehicle. Inside his home, investigators found a .243 caliber rifle, later identified as the murder weapon. Blood traces and hair samples reportedly consistent with the victim were presented at trial. Clayton denied involvement and maintained that the evidence had been mishandled. Eyewitness accounts conflicted, with at least one recanting their original testimony. Questions were raised during appeals about the reliability of the forensic findings and the lack of physical evidence directly placing Clayton at the scene of the murder. Despite those concerns, and multiple legal challenges, the conviction stood. His case received little media attention outside the state. Clayton spent over a decade on death row. He reportedly found faith in prison and corresponded with supporters who believed in his innocence. He maintained until the end that he had not committed the crime. The day before his execution, Clayton requested 3 fried chicken breasts, a lettuce and cucumber salad with vinegar, and a pitcher of iced water. He met briefly with family members and prayed with his spiritual advisor. James Clayton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit on May 25, 2000. He was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. His final words were, "I would like to take this moment as an example of Christ. I want to follow his example and leave with peace in my heart and forgiveness. I just want to testify to all of you that I love you. Jesus is Lord." Ireneo Tristan Montoya, State of Texas. Ireneo Tristan Montoya was executed in Texas on June 18, 1997, for the 1985 murder of James Bennett, a 71-year-old retired U.S. Air Force colonel. The killing took place during a robbery in Houston. Montoya and an accomplice entered Bennett's home, tied him up, and fatally beat him with a pistol before stealing his wallet and car. Montoya, a Mexican national, fled to Mexico shortly after the crime. He was later arrested and extradited to the United States. During interrogation, he confessed to his role in the robbery and assault, though he claimed he had not intended to kill Bennett. Investigators recovered the stolen car and personal belongings belonging to the victim. Forensic evidence supported the account. At trial, prosecutors presented Montoya's confession, physical evidence, and testimony from his accomplice. The jury found him guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death in 1986. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was that Montoya was not informed of his right to consular assistance under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. The Mexican government and international legal bodies protested the violation, calling for a stay of execution. The U.S. courts declined to intervene. Montoya spent over a decade on death row. He was described as quiet and cooperative by prison officials. His appeals centered around international law violations, but the courts maintained that his trial had met domestic legal standards. The day before his execution, Montoya requested a last meal of chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, pinto beans, and corn tortillas. He spent his final hours with a Catholic priest and declined visits from Mexican consular officials. Ireneo Tristan Montoya was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on June 18, 1997. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. His final words were, "I have committed many sins in my life. I ask God to forgive me. I am at peace." Noel Jesse Castillo, State of Texas. Noel Jesse Castillo was executed in Texas on August 9, 1998, for the 1991 murder of 46-year-old Rosa Fuentes during a robbery in Behar County. According to court records, Castillo entered the victim's home through a window, assaulted her, and fatally stabbed her in the chest. He fled the scene with several stolen items, including jewelry and cash. He was arrested days later after pawning some of the stolen property. During interrogation, Castillo confessed to the crime. Investigators recovered additional evidence linking him to the scene, including fingerprints and a blood-stained shirt found in his possession. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the attack and Castillo's detailed confession. Defense attorneys argued that Castillo had an IQ in the low 60s and demonstrated significant cognitive impairments. They contended he was not mentally competent to stand trial or fully understand the consequences of his actions. Mental health experts testified that Castillo struggled with adaptive functioning and abstract reasoning. Despite this, the court ruled him competent and the jury sentenced him to death. His case drew the attention of disability rights organizations and mental health advocates, who argued that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violated both legal and moral standards. All appeals were denied. While on death row, Castillo displayed childlike behavior and required assistance from fellow inmates and staff for basic tasks. Letters from supporters described him as compliant and quiet. He rarely spoke to the press. On August 8, 1998, he was served a last meal of cheese enchiladas, Spanish rice, refried beans, and a slice of tres leches cake. He spent his final day reading the Bible and speaking with a chaplain. Noel Jesse Castillo was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on August 9, 1998. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. His final words were, "I'm sorry for everything. I hope God takes care of all of you. I'm ready." Walter Williams, State of Texas. Walter Williams was executed in Texas on May 13, 1997, for the 1979 murder of 66-year-old Rosalie Pete during a robbery in Houston. Pete was attacked in her home, where she was beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Her body was discovered by relatives who had grown concerned when she failed to answer the phone. Williams, who was 25 at the time, became a suspect after police received a tip placing him near the victim's home. He was arrested shortly after and allegedly confessed during police interrogation, though the statement was not recorded. Investigators said he had items belonging to the victim in his possession. No eyewitnesses directly saw the crime occur. At trial, prosecutors presented the confession, circumstantial evidence, and forensic analysis linking Williams to the scene. The defense argued that Williams was illiterate, mentally impaired, and unable to understand the proceedings. Multiple evaluations showed his IQ to be below 70. Nonetheless, he was declared competent and found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death in 1980. Over the following years, appeals were filed on the basis of intellectual disability, ineffective counsel, and constitutional violations. Advocates claimed he didn't fully comprehend his trial, conviction, or death sentence. The courts upheld the ruling, and his execution was scheduled. Williams spent over 17 years on death row. He was described by prison staff as quiet and often withdrawn. He did not communicate much with other inmates and rarely spoke about his case. The day before his execution, Williams requested a last meal of fried chicken, French fries, biscuits, and sweet tea. He spent time with a spiritual advisor and received a visit from one of his sisters. Walter Williams was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on May 13, 1997. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. His final words were, "I don't have much to say. I hope God takes me in his hands." Kenneth Allen McDuff, State of Texas. Kenneth Allen McDuff was executed in Texas on November 17, 1998. He had been convicted of multiple murders, with his crimes spanning 2 decades and triggering widespread public outrage. His case became infamous not just for its brutality but for the fact that McDuff had once been released on parole, only to kill again. McDuff was originally sentenced to death in 1966 for the murders of 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, her boyfriend Robert Brand, and Brand's cousin Mark Dunham. He abducted them from a rural Texas road, shot the boys, and raped and strangled Sullivan with a broomstick. His sentence was later commuted to life after the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Furman v. Georgia, which temporarily invalidated death penalty statutes across the country. In 1989, amid prison overcrowding, McDuff was paroled. Within a year, young women began disappearing. He was linked to the 1992 abduction, rape, and murder of Melissa Northrup, a 22-year-old store clerk who was taken during a robbery and found strangled with a belt weeks later. Authorities also connected him to several other killings, including the murder of Colleen Reed, who was abducted from an Austin car wash in broad daylight. McDuff was arrested in Kansas City in May 1992 after a nationwide manhunt. He confessed to several murders and led investigators to human remains, though he later recanted parts of his confession. He was tried and convicted again in 1993 for the murder of Melissa Northrup and sentenced to death. His release and reoffending sparked intense criticism of the Texas parole system. New legislation quickly followed, tightening parole eligibility for violent offenders and reinstating stronger death penalty statutes. McDuff spent 6 years on death row. He was defiant until the end, showing no remorse and at times taunting law enforcement and the families of his victims. He granted several interviews where he alternated between denial, vague admissions, and provocations. The day before his execution, he requested a last meal of 2 T-bone steaks, French fries, a pound of fried bacon, fried chicken, 4 fried eggs, onion rings, sliced tomatoes, lettuce, ranch dressing, and a gallon of milk. He refused spiritual counseling. Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on November 17, 1998. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. His final words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." Robert Lloyd Drew, State of Texas. Robert Lloyd Drew was executed in Texas on August 2, 1994, for the 1983 murder of 17-year-old Jeffrey Mays during a robbery in Pasadena. Mays was abducted from a gas station where he worked. His body was later found in a drainage ditch, shot in the head at close range. Drew was 19 years old at the time of the crime. Authorities identified Drew after witnesses placed him near the crime scene, and he was arrested days later. He initially denied involvement but later made statements interpreted as confessions during custodial questioning. The prosecution argued the murder was deliberate, motivated by robbery and racial animus. At trial, Drew was assigned a court-appointed attorney with limited experience in capital cases. Advocates later alleged that his defense failed to properly challenge the prosecution's narrative or present mitigating evidence. They also pointed to the racial dynamics of the case. Drew, a black man, had been convicted by an all-white jury for killing a white teen in a heavily segregated area. No expert witnesses testified on Drew's behalf. He was sentenced to death in 1984. Over the next decade, Drew's appeals raised claims of ineffective counsel and constitutional violations. Civil rights groups argued that the trial had been fundamentally unfair. In the early 1990s, his case was reopened and reviewed again under Governor N. Richards and, later, Governor George W. Bush. Despite increased scrutiny and calls for clemency, the sentence was upheld. On death row, Drew remained quiet and largely isolated. He rarely spoke to the press. Letters written in his final year indicated feelings of abandonment and confusion about the legal process that condemned him. He requested a last meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread, and a root beer. He did not request any visitors in his final 24 hours but met briefly with a prison chaplain. Robert Drew was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on August 2, 1994. He was pronounced dead at 12:26 a.m. His last words were brief. "I hope this brings peace to the victim's family. That's all." These were the final words, final meals, and final moments of the worst of people executed under George Walker Bush. But after hearing their stories, some filled with doubt, last-minute confessions, and claims of innocence, let me ask you this: if even one of them was wrongly executed, does the whole system lose its right to kill? Yes or no? Drop your thoughts below. If you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. This is Sin, Crime, and Silence Records.